What's up guys, this is Pick Up and Read Theology. I'm Gabe, and this is our very first video on what I think is going to be a long series on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. But before we get started, before we even do an introduction to the book of Ephesians, we're going to do a historical deep dive. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some extra biblical historical sources so that we can kind of build up a framework and lay a backdrop of what was going on when we're finally introduced to the city of Ephesus in Acts chapter 18 and more thoroughly in Acts chapter 19. Sit back, get your notebooks out, prepare to learn some Greek mythology, prepare to hear some legends on how the city originated, and maybe even see some names that are familiar to you from past history lessons. As a disclaimer, I'm not a historian. I am not an expert. I rely on the scholarship and expertise of people in these fields of ancient history. So throughout the video, if I'm making an assertion or giving some sort of historical fact or a date, right here at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the author of a specific work and the title of that work or the name of the website that I got that information of. I highly encourage you to check for yourself. Down in the description, you'll see every single citation throughout the video listed in kind of a loose 6th, 7th edition APA format. But go down there, check out the websites, learn this stuff for yourself. It's incredibly important that you, as a learner, do not just take the information from anybody who can make a YouTube video and go find out for yourself. And I think you're going to be amazed what happens when on your own initiative, with your own thinking, your own ability to read and understand and comprehend, you're going to be amazed what happens when you pick up and read. So let's go. So even if you know nothing about Greek mythology, I'd be willing to bet that you've heard of this guy named Zeus. Apparently he had a thing for the ladies, and he had a set of 2 illegitimate twins with a Titan goddess named Leto. As you may have been able to guess, Zeus's wife was very upset at Leto and somehow forbade her from giving birth to the twins anywhere on planet Earth. So Leto goes to the island of Delos, and there she gives birth to her firstborn, a girl named Artemis. In Greek mythology, or really in Roman mythology, this Greek goddess is known as Diana, which is probably the name you've heard her go by. Through some other curses and weird Greek mythology stuff going on, she was not allowed to give birth to the second child until 9 days later. Artemis, the brand new born baby, assisted her mother in the birth of her younger brother named Apollo. Because of this, in a lot of areas throughout the ancient world, Artemis was seen to be more powerful than her brother Apollo and became known as the goddess of fertility, the goddess of the hunt, and she was also known as a lunar deity, which I'm not totally sure what that means. The reason that this is important is because temples were built all over the ancient world to the Greek goddess and to her younger brother Apollo as well. You can check out the story even more on your own if you're interested in finding out more about Apollo, more about Artemis, and how these two played out in Greek mythology. But regarding the history of Ephesus, this is going to suffice for now. If you're still with me, you're probably thinking, what in the world does this have to do with Ephesus? I'm glad you asked. The founding of the city is really based off of legend, and anything past the 6th century BC is really kind of shaky and hearsay, and not really reliable sources of history can tell us exactly what was going on. Legend number 1 on how the city was found is based off this guy named Androclus. His father, who was a king, had passed away, and instead of wanting to compete with his brothers for the throne, he wanted to go start a city of his own. Seeking wisdom, he goes to the oracle of Delphi, who was a priestess of aforementioned Apollo, actually. I thought that was interesting. And he asked her, where do I build a new city? Her answer was, a fish and a wild boar will tell you where to put your new city. According to the legend, he sets out just a little bit confused and not totally sure about the prophecy, and he finds himself on the western shore of a place called Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. While on the shore, he's frying a fish. The fish somehow flops out, starts a fire, the flames spread to a nearby bush, and out of the bush runs a wild boar. Seeing the fish, seeing the wild boar, he remembers the prophecy of the Oracle of Delphi, and so is born the city of Ephesus sometime in 1300 BC. Legend number 2 says that a tribe of female warriors called the Amazons founded the city in roughly 1400 BC. But again, both of these are just legend. To put it into a timeline of what's happening biblically at this time, this is roughly during the era where the Jews have made it into the promised land and now judges are ruling the land. So sort of the end of Joshua and the majority of the book of Judges. Fast forward quite a bit of time to the 6th century and we see Ephesus under Lydian rule. The Lydian Empire pretty much took up the western half of modern day Turkey and was actually the first empire to mint coin. What's super interesting is that people in this region and in the city of Ephesus believe that Artemis was actually born born at the city of Ephesus and not on the island of Delos like the legend said. So in 550 BC, the king of Lydia named Croesus funds the construction of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. This temple was massive, just a little bit bigger than a football field. It took over 10 years to make. It was made out of marble and precious metals and had a ginormous shrine of Artemis built out of wood. This place was actually known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world at the time. It would do you some good to remember this temple because it's going to pop up again a little bit later. But we'll get to that. During this time, what's happening in the Bible is in Ezra chapter 1, where the Persian king Cyrus issues a decree that the Jews can go back to Jerusalem and build a temple. This same guy, Cyrus the Great, comes in 546 BC and obliterates the Lydian kingdom, and now Ephesus is under Persian rule. A lot of the cities in the area did not like the idea of being under Persian rule and therefore rebelled, and therefore were completely obliterated. Ephesus was pretty chill about it though, and so they were spared any kind of destruction and continued to thrive as a gigantic metropolis and a very important port of trade. And they stayed under Persian rule for about 200 years with no issues. On our biblical timeline, we are now in the intertestamental period, with the last word coming from Malachi in 430 BC, so we don't really see much going on here. Back to the Temple of Artemis, on July 20th, 356, it is burned to the ground by a madman who burns it down simply for the sake of wanting to be remembered throughout all of history. What's kind of ironic is I don't remember his name, and I forgot to put it in my notes here, so it kind of sucks to be that guy. What is interesting though is legend has it that the reason that the temple was burned down is Artemis, if you'll remember, she is the goddess of childbirth, or that's at least one of her attributes. She was attending to the call in Macedonia to a child that was born on that very same night who became known as Alexander the Great. Fast forward about 20 years later, and Alexander the Great comes in with his army, liberates the region from any kind of Persian ownership, and then decides that he wants to rebuild this temple. Again, legend has it that our boy Alex goes into the city of Ephesus, sees the burned down temple, and offers to pay to rebuild it if they can inscribe his name on the front. The reply was that it is inappropriate for a god to give offerings or gifts to another god, so the Ephesians ultimately refused Alexander the Great's offer and rebuilt the temple themselves using personal jewelry and fine metals. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great dies. He has a lot of generals though that each sprout up their own little mini empires, and one of those guys was Lysimachus, and he gets control and ownership over Ephesus. And he does a lot of good things for the city. Before doing any sort of renovations or anything, he moves the entire location of the city 2 miles to the southwest and constructs a new harbor. He builds big walls that are fortified, and he asks all the Ephesians to come live in his new location. The Ephesians were not happy about having to move their homes, so they ultimately refused. Lysimachus, being a pretty nice guy, locks up the sewage system going to the city, rendering the old location, or at least the houses in the old location, completely uninhabitable, moving all the people from the current location down to his new city. If that's not enough, he decides to rename the city of Ephesus Arsenia after his wife. Remember how I told you Alexander the Great had a lot of different generals and they all set up their own little empires? Well, there was a guy to the east who was in charge of the empire called the Seleucian Empire. This is the one that we see reference to in the book of the Maccabees during this intertestamental period. In 281 BC, he challenges Lysimachus in battle, and Lysimachus loses. So now the city of Arsenia is refounded as Ephesus. In 263, Ephesus falls under Egyptian rule, and then shortly later in 196, it goes back to the Seleucian Empire. Just 6 years later, Ephesus is now under control of the king of Pergamum. That's right, the same Pergamum that's housing one of the 7 churches that you see listed in the book of Revelation. In history, we're not there yet, but it's the same place. I thought it was kind of cool. A little over 50 years later, in 129, Ephesus comes under control of the Roman Empire. What's fascinating is that it's not some sort of battle or conquest or anything like that, but instead the king of Pergamum leaves the city of Ephesus in his will to the Roman Empire. And just like that, Ephesus is Roman now. Over the next 50 years, we see kind of a cultural shift in Ephesus as Latin-speaking people begin flooding the city, bringing their different gods and their culture, and just kind of changing the atmosphere of the city altogether. In the region, there were a lot angry about the high tax rates of the Roman Empire, and in 88 BC, something known as the Mithridates Massacre leaves 80,000 Latin-speaking Italians dead, with the majority of them in the streets of Ephesus. This little uprising is kind of complex and involves the use of Roman soldiers and rebelling Roman generals. It's really interesting to read about. Fast forward just 50 years later, and we have the very first emperor of Rome. That's right, your one and only Caesar Augustus. Now, if you remember in a couple of your Gospels, this is the same guy who pulled the strings, caused the census to bring Mary and Joseph back to Bethlehem, ultimately fulfilling the prophecy of the Messiah that was talked about all through the Old Testament. In 31 BC, Caesar Augustus moves the capital of the Roman Empire over Asia Minor from Pergamum down to Ephesus. This is like the equivalent of moving Washington, D.C. The economy of Ephesus at this time is booming, with people coming through the city all the time. It is also geographically, it's at the end of a very important trade route, the same route that Paul used on his third missionary journey to even get to Ephesus. The culture is flooded with new people, with immigrants, with travelers, with traders, with entrepreneurs trying to make a business selling things. Like, this place is doing pretty good for itself at this point. One thing that's built during this time is the amphitheater, which we're going to see later on when we get to Acts, but you'll have to hold on. Now that we're in New Testament times, go forward just a little bit to 17 AD, and there's a huge earthquake that completely devastates the city, but it quickly builds back up because it has a pretty booming economy and it's doing okay for itself. Other than that, there's not much left in the books about Ephesus until we get to the Bible, until we move forward in church history past the New Testament. But a couple of things are really important to notice. We've got a multicultural city in an ancient world. We've got multiple deities that are tolerated, but the chief deity is that of the Greek goddess Artemis, and her temple is a place that people travel from all over the world to see. As people travel through the city of Ephesus, they make sure they go to the temple so that they can offer a sacrifice to Artemis so that she'll bless their fertility or their hunting or an impending childbirth or whatever it may be. And this is huge business for the city. One ancient historian noted that the streets of Ephesus at night were lined with streetlights that were lit with oil. That's something that wasn't too common at the time, but because Ephesus was so rich and so well off, it was able to afford that. The population during this time is anywhere from 200 to 250,000 people. Now, for my North Carolina friends, that's roughly the size of modern day Winston-Salem. This place is gigantic. On top of the gold and silversmiths who are making a killing off of the people traveling through, purchasing their little relics to offer up to Artemis, another huge factor that brought in a ton of money to the economy was the art of magic and superstition. It was incredibly common at the time to sell little booklets full of these little magical spells. We actually have a collection of these today called the Greek Papyri, which you can go online and check out. And one thing that I think is very important to note and incredibly relevant to our New Testament study of the city of Ephesus is that the largest group of Jews in Asia Minor lived here in Ephesus. These guys were Hellenistic Jews, and they were world-renowned, as noted by guys like Josephus, for their magic or for their practice of magic. And Jews were very, very superstitious and would use kind of the fame that Judaism had throughout the entire world and put a weird twist on it to make it fit into something that was sellable in a superstitious city like Ephesus. Jews were believed to have some sort of dark and magical, mysterious power, and would even call on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to woo the people into buying their stuff. Throughout the city, they were known for selling magical amulets to bring you health, or some sort of weird inscribed ring to make you more intelligent. And it's guys like this right here that our boy Paul butts heads with in Acts chapter 19. And this is a scene that I am incredibly excited to get to. For now, this is going to have to do it for our hyper-condensed history of the city of Ephesus. I hope that you learned something. I hope that this was fun, and I hope that you are encouraged to tune in for the next one and to learn more. Above everything else, though, I hope that you are encouraged to see that anyone can do this sort of thing and learn about a place in the Bible. Just like pulling a loose thread from a shirt that's connected to a million other threads, a place or a person or an event in history can be like this too. And as you start to pull on it, you'll see a name that you recognize and you'll hunt down that lead. And as you pull it some more, you'll see a place that you recognize and you'll hunt down that lead. And pretty soon you have interconnected yourself with the entire Bible. This is what happens when you pick up and read theology. We'll see you next time.